Who kicked off civilization? The Romans with their magnificent buildings and military muscle, the Greeks with science and democracy, the Egyptians with their fabulous kingdoms? Well, none of them. In a part of the world known as Mesopotamia, long-lost people came up with everything from the wheel to writing, armies to agriculture, bread to beer. Here at home, I'll be getting to the bottom of some of the incredible inventions that shaped the way we live today. And I've sent roving reporter Hermione Coburn off to Mesopotamia in search of the civilizations history almost forgot.
There are tens of thousands of burial mounds all around me.
Mesopotamia means the land between the rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates that flow through modern-day Syria and Iraq. In this narrow strip of land, human history began. The Mesopotamians weren't just a single people, but a whole series of overlapping civilizations. The Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Babylonians and the Assyrians, each one building on the achievements of the one before, and between them they laid the foundations of our civilization.
But visualising just how far back in time all these people were living isn't easy. So I've come here to the Roman city of Palmyra in Syria, one of the world's most important archaeological sites.
Now, this ancient city dates back a little under 2,000 years. Mesopotamian cities were growing 6,000 years ago.
Mesopotamian cities are 3 times older than Rome. They once rose all over this region. Pyramid-like towers called ziggurats, the very word means to build high, dominated the skyline. But only in the last 200 years have archaeologists uncovered these lost civilizations. The wind, the rain and the punishing sun left very little evidence of Mesopotamia above ground. The Romans built for eternity out of stone, but the Mesopotamians used something far more down to earth.
Mud was the building block of civilization. One of the first great Mesopotamian inventions was this wooden frame that made the mass production of identical mud bricks possible. Like that, like that, like that.
Bravo, bravo. Okay.
With these bricks, the Mesopotamians created a world that lasted for 4,500 years and gave mankind its first cities. In Mesopotamia, natural resources like stone and timber were scarce, but mud was plentiful, and it wasn't just used for building.
The rich mud was ideal for growing crops and encouraged nomadic tribes to settle in these valleys. But the mud came at a price. The Tigris and Euphrates are very unpredictable rivers, and they could unleash devastating floods that could wipe out entire communities at any time. Mesopotamians developed sophisticated irrigation techniques to control the waters, helping farmers to grow more grain. More food meant more people, and the population just grew and grew. Villages became towns, towns became cities. Not everyone had to be a farmer, and civilization blossomed.
Controlling and harnessing the river waters is just as important today in the Middle East as it was in Mesopotamian times.
These are the water wheels of Hama, north of Damascus. You can hear them groaning from miles away.
Night and day, they scoop up water from the river and lift it up to aqueducts, which once fed the fields and gardens of the city. These fantastic feats of engineering are relatively young, only 800 years old. But some say the Mesopotamians' mastery of irrigation allowed them to build something even more wonderful thousands of years before these water wheels were invented.
Once they mastered irrigation, the Mesopotamians found all sorts of things were possible. The Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar was worried about keeping happy his beautiful wife, Amytis. She longed for the trees and the mountains of her homeland, and so, according to legend, he built her the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Of course, they probably weren't actually hanging as such. They were sort of terraces and mounds with beautiful greenery. But, according to the Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, the terraces were 320 feet high. That's twice as high as the walls of this castle. How on earth do you water a garden that big? Well, we don't know how Neb actually got the water up to the top of the Hanging Gardens, but there are various possibilities. And Marty and his team have built 3 wonderful machines. We're going to race them and see which is best. First up, we've got Alex with the shadoof. Now, Alex, how does this work?
It's very simple. This is like a leather bag or a bucket,
Right.
which we cast out into the water, and then it's connected to this lever here with a counterweight on the other side.
Oh, wow!
Yeah.
So that, oh, I see, that helps you lift
Yeah,
the weight of
that's right,
water.
that's very simple.
And then you swing it over and tip it in here.
Yeah.
Going to win?
Oh, I think so, yeah.
Well, it's been around a long time anyway. Next up, Marty with an Archimedes screw. Marty, I thought Archimedes invented this.
Almost certainly not. I'm afraid the Mesopotamians beat him to it, and they had these devices, yeah.
So, is this going to work?
Absolutely.
It looks a bit ramshackle to me.
I'm very confident.
Okay, and last but not least, we've got oh, that's Chris in the water, fending off the sharks. Good luck. But Rob, you're driving the thing, yes?
I am indeed, yes.
So what do you have to do?
It's a bucket and chain system where we're pulling the water out here, taking it up to the top, dropping it through the pipe and into the terracotta bowl.
Well, it looks good.
It does indeed.
Is it going to work?
Of course.
You're going to win?
Yeah, there's no question.
We'll see. Right, chaps, back to your marks. We're going to have a Le Mans start. So back to the middle of the path, if you would. Gird up your loins. Get ready. Okay. On your marks. Get set. Go! The shadoof has been around for at least 3,000 years, and it's still in use today. It's basically just a giant lever, so there's very little to go wrong. Simple, but brilliant. The bucket chain is especially good for raising water from confined spaces like wells or mines. With a few modifications, it could be powered by animals. It's even said that the inventor of the first elevator got his big idea from seeing a picture of one of these in an encyclopedia. If the Hanging Gardens did use the Archimedes screw, as some researchers believe, then it must have been invented hundreds of years before the Greek genius was born. Whatever the truth, it's still around today. And because it's especially good at lifting solids and liquids together, it's often used in sewage works. Wow! Look at the Archimedes screw! Hey, it's a close thing. It's a close thing. Ah, you're over the top! Fantastic! Just made it! Wow. Can you just show me how that works again?
It's a truly effective machine. It's kind of like a pasta spiral.
So you just pull it round,
and
water
lift the
pulled
water
up all the way up,
continuously up.
and just spews
Look
out
at
an
it, it
enormous
comes out at
quantity.
an enormous rate.
Well, there we are, ladies and gentlemen, absolutely no doubt. Archimedes screw, fantastically efficient, but I have to hand a good second prize to the shadoof. And as for the bucket and chain, I think I better not say anything about that. So, maybe we should rename the Archimedes screw the Nebuchadnezzar screw. Mind you, it would have taken an awful lot of them to lift the thousands of gallons of water needed to keep the gardens green, and I'm not sure Queen Amytis would have fancied her gardens being full of sweaty slaves all the time. With irrigation, the Mesopotamians were learning to control the mysterious forces of nature, but they still faced many dangers. Droughts, crop failures, plagues and floods all seemed to be sent by the gods. Their world was ruled by supernatural powers, and they were very wary of the unknown, especially of the land beyond their fertile valleys.
Somewhere out here in the desert lurk monsters and demons, just waiting to wreak destruction. Well, at least that's what many ancient Mesopotamians believed. Illnesses were often said to be caused by malevolent spirits inhabiting your body, and the fear of possession might drive a Mesopotamian to visit the Ashaput, a kind of spiritual doctor or exorcist who could help drive out those harmful demons. In many parts of the Middle East, such people still exist today, and they're said to be especially good at dealing with hidden fears. This lady has promised to capture my fear demon and send him packing.
The basic idea is to trick my demon into leaving my body by tempting him to jump into something else which comes into contact with me. These ladies are using molten lead dropped into a bowl of water over my head. They say I'll know the demon has gone when the hot lead shatters as it hits the water. It may take a few goes though. I seem to have a very stubborn demon. The Mesopotamians probably didn't use lead, but they practiced the same principle of contact and transference.
A genuine Mesopotamian exorcism involved bread and mice. What would happen is that the Ashipu would rub bread on you and then collect the crumbs that had fallen on the floor. And then you would spit in them and transfer your illness or your demon into those crumbs. Then you would collect the crumbs and take them out into the desert and scatter them to the god of small rodents. Now when the poor unfortunate rodents ate those crumbs, they would inherit your demon. Ready to go again? Yes, that's it. Okay. Well, I can't say I feel completely changed, but you never know. So now what do I do with the pieces of lead? To take them out and scatter them in 3 different directions. Let's hope this works. I'm taking no chances with my demon. I've come to the top of the highest hill and I'm scattering the lead in 3 different directions to confuse it so it can never find its way back to me. The Mesopotamians were extremely superstitious. Another thing they believed in was fortune telling. They saw the future in the strangest of places.
Absolutely. Casting out demons is fine, but prevention is better than cure. The Mesopotamians believed that the future lay in the lap of the gods, and that sometimes they left some obscure signs as to what might be about to happen. If you could read the signs, you could see the future. They did look in some very odd places. One of their favourites was in the entrails of a sheep. There is a theory that this business of seeing the future from the entrails of slaughtered animals was scientific. I personally find that very hard to believe. But with me here is Irving Finkel, who's an expert from the British Museum. Irving, it wasn't really scientific, was it?
Well, people are very rude about Babylonian science, but I've been working in cuneiform tablets for many, many years, and in my opinion, this discipline, this method of predicting the future, really does qualify as a science.
Go on, explain.
I'll tell you why.
Yeah.
Because there were generations of very closely observed details recorded in a systematic way. And it provided a kind of system for understanding how the universe worked. And there were practitioners who used this system, and state policies were decided by it on a large scale and a small scale. Many aspects of society centered on this activity. So within its own terms, I think you cannot dismiss it as anything other than a real science.
OK, so give me an example of what they would decide.
Well, the way it might work was, let's say you're the king, you're thinking of going to war. You want to know the right day of the week to leave on for obvious superstitious reasons. Should you go on the Tuesday morning? So you come to me as the diviner.
Yeah.
We go over the road. We get one of the sheep, which is in very good condition, nothing wrong with it.
Right.
Bring it here, open it up with our knife,
Right.
take out the liver, and
Yeah.
while it's still hot and steamy, we examine it all over for what we know we're looking for.
You mean, hang on a sec, is there a bit of it that says war on Tuesday?
Not exactly, but what happened is this. The zones of the liver, it's divided up into areas that the Babylonians knew very well. Each one of these zones had its specific area of responsibility. So we would look for the bit that was to do with the throne, for example, or the palace, or warfare, and we'd put together the evidence from the different things to see what the final message was. So in principle, if your liver was in perfect condition with no signs of disease, then the answer will be fine, whatever the question was.
Can you predict my future? What's going to happen to me tomorrow?
What's going to happen to you tomorrow? Well, let's have a look at this liver. Again, it's actually, as I said, in very good shape. There's nothing really that's very alarming. Wait a moment. There's no gallbladder. Whoever gave us this liver has removed the gallbladder entirely.
Does that matter?
It does matter. A liver without a gallbladder is about the worst possible omen you can ever imagine.
What does it mean then?
Probably the end of the world or something of that kind.
End of the world?
Yes.
Have you got time to clear up that mess?
Yes.
I'm off to find a better diviner. Well, I don't reckon divination would be regarded as a science today, but then lots of people look to their future in the stars. The Mesopotamians looked at the patterns of the stars in the sky and came up with the signs of the zodiac that we still use today. And they cast horoscopes. All this astronomical know-how allowed the priests accurately to predict the coming of the seasons. And that was vital for one of the greatest innovations in human history, farming.
4,000 years ago, a farmer wrote down for his son a complete guide to Mesopotamian farming. It was the first farmer's almanac, and it's going to help me through a year down on the ancient farm. The only problem is I can't use any modern equipment, and I've only got a day to spare.
That ancient farmer's almanac is full of useful suggestions. Work should begin at daybreak. Make sure to plough your furrows straight and narrow. And don't forget to perform the rites against mice and small birds. Possibly the world's first pest control measures.
This land is part of what's known as the Fertile Crescent, a bow-shaped stretch of land that begins on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean, curves round the Syrian desert and back along the valley of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers to the Persian Gulf. Now, blessed with dry summers and rainy winters, it was where the wild ancestors of wheat and barley first grew and wild goat and sheep roamed. As such, it provided perfect conditions for man's earliest experiments with food production. Animals were first domesticated and the land cultivated approximately 10,000 years ago.
The agricultural season starts with ploughing and sowing in late October, ready for the rains. It was the Mesopotamians' invention of the plough that really revolutionised farming. The land was soon producing surplus food. Harvesting usually starts around April and can go on into August. Hard work. But the almanac warns that it's bad form for a farmer to ask anyone else to do their field work for them.
After the grain has ripened, it needs to be harvested using a sickle, and the shape of the sickle helps you collect a whole sheaf in one go. Now, we're lucky because we're using iron sickles, whereas the Mesopotamians would have used bronze, and bronze blunts very easily. So they had to employ another man to work out in the field full time just to sharpen the blades.
As soon as the crop has been harvested, it needs to be broken down to release the grain. The Mesopotamians developed a simple, animal-powered machine called a threshing sledge to make the job easier.
The barley's piled high and gradually broken down by the horse's hooves and the weight of the threshing sledge into a much smaller pile. Stone teeth on the underside of the sledge bruise the grain, splitting the hull and releasing the seed. And the stalks are just pulverised into dust, but that leaves most of the seed intact. Now, for the winnowing stage, we need wind, and it needs to blow in a constant direction. Toss the waste and the seed up into the air, and in theory, the chaff is blown beyond the stones, and the heavier seeds fall back down to the floor. Now, this is one time where there's no singing, because otherwise you're likely to end up with a mouthful of chaff. Now, this is very itchy work, and I'm told that women would often strip down to their underwear, which must have been fun for the chap sitting on the threshing sledge.
Finally, the grain is passed through a series of sieves to get rid of the last of the chaff. And that's it, the end of another year down on the farm.
Nowadays, working in the fields is a lot easier, but it all started with the Mesopotamians.
The Mesopotamians came up with many of the things, like farming, that we now take for granted. But there's one possible invention that even today has experts arguing about whether we need to rewrite the history books: the Baghdad Battery. In 1938, a small clay pot was found just outside Baghdad. Inside was a copper cylinder surrounding an iron bar. What was this thing for? Well, all you needed to do was to add a bit of acid, a bit of vinegar, a bit of grape juice, and you'd get some electricity out of it. And Marty has made a modern Baghdad battery.
We have indeed.
This is just a flower pot, right?
It's a flower pot. Do you want to pour some vinegar in?
That's ordinary vinegar, yes?
Just ordinary household vinegar. And then we have a copper pipe.
Yes.
And this is a steel nail, so that's my iron bar.
Okay.
So that
down
drops
the
in
middle.
there, down the middle. And I'm actually using a little, this is my clever bit. This is stops the two shorting out.
They use a bit of bitumen or pitch.
They use bitumen.
Yes.
And then all we have to do is drop that in there, and that's it. And we can measure, we'll have a look and see if we can get anything out of it. So that goes in there like that. And then if I attach that to there and that to there, oh, you can see there's a little.
Yes, there were. It's kicking. About what?
It's about half a volt.
Half a volt. Now, it's not a lot, is it? The thing is that the concept of electricity couldn't have been totally alien to those Mesopotamians because they did have electric fish. Just look at these fish here. And if I put the microphone in, you should hear some clicking because they're making tiny amounts of electricity. So they clearly knew a little bit about electricity. So the question is, what on earth might they have used these batteries for, if indeed they were batteries? What's your theory, Marty?
Well, I mean, has been a suggestion that they use them for electroplating. And that seems reasonable to me because the iron rod inside gets effectively copper plated in this reaction. The copper kind of ends up on the iron rod.
Right.
So there must be enough to do that sort of chemistry.
Right.
So maybe you could.
I like that electroplating theory because I happen to know that when they were curing leather, they generated the sort of chemicals with which you can dissolve gold. And if you do that, then you can electroplate gold onto, say, silver statues and make them look a lot more valuable. That would have been a terrific coup. Now, Irving, you got the blood off your hands. Good. Now, what about this? Do you think they were electroplating statues?
I don't believe a word of this electroplating theory, I'm afraid. It's romantic and wonderful, but I don't believe it. I believe that in Mesopotamia they discovered by accident one day, perhaps with a bowl of vinegar and an iron spoon or something, that you could get a kind of frisson out of it, but they didn't understand anything about electricity and they had no function for it. I think these things belong in the field of what you might call curing, and I think there are two real possibilities. One is that if you had an archipou or a priest dealing with a patient who thought they were bewitched, who had diseases, and with a lot of mumbo-jumbo and build-up, he said, you know, the climax of the thing, if you touch this with your finger, you will feel this and everything will be better, then that would have been very effective.
Driving out the evil spirit?
Yes, that sort of thing.
Don't believe, you're a cynic, aren't you? You don't believe in chemistry?
I don't believe in chemistry. I failed my GCSE. So, but the other possibility is, which is not totally separate, is that we know from the classical authors that sometimes electric fish, like these little specimens here, were utilised in the treatment of pain. They had these fish, which presumably if you touch it with a wet bare foot, gave you a little shock, and experience shows them that it did cure some kinds of physical pain. So I think one or other explanation is much more probable than the fancy electroplating scheme.
Maybe. How are we doing, Marty?
Well, let's have a look. Let's see what we can get.
You've wired them all up. Hey!
That's about 3 volts.
3 volts. Well, that's jolly good. We can
let's
almost
see whether it can.
Now look,
there you go.
It's jolly hot in that part of the world. An electric fan would have been really useful, wouldn't it?
Yes, exactly.
Much better than an electric shock to cure you of your demons.
I quite like Irving's idea. And I wonder whether if we lit the terminals of this, we might be able to...
Now, there's an idea.
Rather you than me, Marty. Go on, yes. I think we better stand back then, yes.
Exactly so.
He may explode.
This I have to see.
I hope this cures something.
Yes. What have you got, Marty? Ingrown toenails?
Oh, yeah.
I don't believe it.
Oh, yeah, no, that's definitely
all right,
all right.
Yeah, it's not lethal, is it?
Not yet, anyway.
See if he changes colour.
Yeah. Yeah?
It works, doesn't it?
You can definitely get a little sort of
like
tingle.
Licking a 9-volt battery.
I don't think my demons have been exorcised totally, but nevertheless they're getting there.
You do feel better, though?
Oh, much better.
Well, that
much
proves
better,
it,
yes.
Absolutely.
Definitely. Whatever they use these batteries for, if indeed they were batteries, there is no doubt that an awful lot of good science starts in the kitchen. And there was one even more fundamental thing discovered in Mesopotamian kitchens thousands and thousands of years ago.
People have been eating bread for thousands of years. And although these women still make their bread in the traditional Mesopotamian way, they buy their flour ready ground. But I brought along this original 3000 BC grinding stone just to see how we get on. Can I have a go? It's actually quite difficult. I can certainly see why you buy your flour from the mill.
Some of our earliest records of food come from the first of the Mesopotamian civilizations, the Sumerians. The wealthiest citizens enjoyed plenty of roast meat and fish in their diet, but for ordinary Sumerians, barley and wheat were the staple foods.
This is probably enough.
Fruit, oils, juices and honey enlivened the basic bread recipe. There were so many varieties that the Mesopotamians are said to have had more than 300 different words for bread.
Now, yeast was a magic ingredient because the Mesopotamians knew that it made the bread rise, but they didn't understand why. Oh, I'm doing it really hard.
And it wasn't just used for everyday consumption. Bread and cakes were also made in Mesopotamian temples for use in religious rituals.
Are you I got it. It's good. It's hot. Shall we try it? Are you? It's very hot. Delicious. We've made this bread using wheat, but the Mesopotamians also had barley. And the interesting thing about barley is that if you moisten it, that starts the fermentation process, and you end up with something far more important than bread.
Absolutely. Neither man nor woman can live by bread alone. And down here in the dungeon, we've got something rather special brewing. Beer. And I've got a whole production line headed by Ian Dixon, who's master brewer at Shepherd Neame. That's quite an old brewery, isn't it?
Since 1698, Adam.
But we're going to brew something rather older than that.
We are. We're going to brew something to a recipe that was put together in 1800 BC.
Wow, that's 3,500 years even before you were invented.
Before we were, yeah.
So where do we start?
We start with barley. That's the basic raw material.
Right.
Yeah, we steep it with water.
So what's the stuff?
This is called bapir.
Bapia.
It's a Sumerian barley bread.
And is it edible?
It is edible, you feel free.
So tell me what's in it before I eat it.
It has barley in it, predominantly barley.
Yes.
Then we have dates and also honey.
Oh, sounds all right.
Serves as
Tastes
useful
all right.
food store.
Very sweet. Very good. Okay, so where does that go? Into the next stage?
This will go on to the next stage of the mashing process.
Okay, Jean.
Yes.
So in here you've got...
We've already put some bapir at the beginning,
Right.
and that's the source of starch.
Right.
We then added some water,
Yeah.
and to get it to the right temperature, which would have been around 63, 65 degrees.
Hang on a sec, they didn't have thermometers, did
No, but they were very clever. They added 2/3 boiling to 1/3 cold, and that would have got the temperature around 63, 65 degrees.
That's very clever, isn't
And that's exactly what we do today in the brewery, but we do use thermometers.
it? You're up to date. So
Yes.
what else needs to go in here?
After the bapir's gone in and we've got it to 63,
Right.
we then would have added some of the ground malt,
Right.
which has come from over there. This is the
Right.
enzyme sauce.
Okay, a bit of this in?
Yes, a little bit, please.
Right,
Thank
like
you.
that, right.
Yes.
Yes.
And
What else do you
then
need?
we need a few dates,
Dates,
please.
good.
This was the abundant fruit of the time.
This is what I like. How much
Yes.
of those?
All of it.
All of it?
Yes.
I'm keeping one for myself.
Yes, okay.
Okay.
Then they would have added more sugar, which obviously would have been, in those days, honey.
Ah,
Yes.
land of milk and honey.
A little bit
I
of
can't
honey.
see. So we've got
Perfect.
dates and honey, and
And
bapia,
bapir,
and this stuff.
malt,
Malt.
and the water.
And how long does that have to
This
sit
would
on?
have stood for about 3 hours to 5 hours, or maybe half a day, before it would have been ready for the next stage.
Now, Chris, what happens next?
Right, this is the next stage in the process. What we've got to do is to use this filter, which is made from reeds that we've collected
It looks
from
like
the...
an old doormat.
Well, no, these are reeds from the banks of the Euphrates that we collected last
Oh,
week.
yeah, I believe you.
Yeah,
Right,
they are,
okay.
they are. Right, so what we're trying to do here is to separate out the nice sugary liquid from the mash.
Yes.
And leave the husks and the,
All the
bits of the dates behind.
Okay.
So if you'd like to hold it over the fermenting
over the
vessel
plastic
there,
one,
this is
yeah.
our fermenter. And we'll empty the mash into the filter.
Right.
And we should get nice wort coming
Yeah.
out of the bottom.
Well, we've
Good.
certainly got liquid coming out the bottom.
Good.
And indeed some of
Good.
the sides
That's
as well.
it.
Keep
That's
tipping, there's
it.
a bit more to go.
Good.
That's it, okay.
Right. That looks pretty good, doesn't it? I'll take that out of the way.
Okay, good.
And just put that
Watch
over
out
there.
for your shoes. Good.
Then, right, the next thing that we do...
Ah, the yeast.
Now, this is yeast.
Oh, it smells wonderful. It smells
delicious.
really, really good. Okay, can we pour that?
Yep, we pour this in, and the idea of this is that it will ferment the sugars into alcohol and carbon dioxide gas.
How much of it goes in?
That's probably about right. Yep,
okay,
that's
good.
it.
Okay, so then, is that it?
Yep, that's it. We now have to wait 5 days, I'm afraid.
5 days,
before we
okay.
can
Well,
drink it.
we're going to have to wait 5 days, so just talk among yourselves, would you? In Sumerian times, beer was unfiltered and cloudy. So they invented the drinking straw, probably a hollow reed, to avoid getting a mouthful of the bitter residue from the bottom of the jar. And they sucked up beer out of communal pots. I think we'll stick to mugs. It's quite nice.
Very good.
It's quite bitter.
Dates and honey.
But it hasn't got any hops in it.
No, they arrived in the 17th century.
So this is thousands of years before hops.
Much before that.
Beer was very important to them. Everyone drank it, not just the men, but the women and the children too, because it was nutritious and also practically sterile because it's so acidic, which meant not only it was much safer than the water from the river, but they even used it to wash wounds and things. Did you know that 40% of the entire grain harvest went into making beer? It can't be anything like that today.
No, it's about 10 to 15%
Exactly. Now, the goddess of beer, I think, was called Ninkasi, is that right? So I think we should drink a toast to Ninkasi. Be quite good down the pub. To Ninkasi! And the beer we made with that 3,000-year-old recipe tastes at least as good as the stuff in my local pub. Of course, a little overindulgence in the amber nectar must have led to exactly the same problems then as it does today. But the Mesopotamians were ready for that. Records show a variety of ways of dealing with public drunkenness. And pubs were also regulated by another amazing Mesopotamian creation, written law. So, the pubs were actually governed by laws, were they?
Well, as a matter of fact, yes. There is a huge monument in Paris which is known as the Code of Hammurabi, the king of Babylon, a great pillar of diorite. And it's inscribed with many laws about society, one of which does talk about a pub, if you like, that the alewife in charge must make sure that she doesn't cheat the punters who are drinking the beer. She has to give them the right amount for the barley that they pay with. And it's just one of a huge range of different topics in society which are covered in this law code.
So they were actually literally set in stone?
That's exactly what they were. When Hammurabi came to the throne, he wanted to make a statement in front of his population and in front of the gods about what he was going to do during his reign. So this law code was written out, put in the public, in the marketplace, theoretically for anybody to read who wanted to. Of course, most people couldn't. But it's a sort of statement of principle of law. It's not a law code that, as it were, judges quoted from in a dispute and said, it says here in the laws, so we're going to do that. It's more do as you would be done by.
So was it just specific crime, specific punishment?
Well, in a way, yes, but they drew their material from daily life. So a good illustration would be the case of a mother with several sons dying. Then her father would have no claim on the dowry, which in Mesopotamian terms was very important, but the law would stipulate that it had to be divided equally between her own children. And that was the sort of thing they were concerned with.
So it was really socially useful. It wasn't, absolutely nailed down specific crime.
Exactly,
right.
Exactly.
And of course, we would never have had the Code of Hammurabi if the Sumerians hadn't invented writing. Now tell me about these alewives.
It's hard to imagine a world without writing. No books, no libraries, no email, no text messaging. But none of this would have been possible without sheep.
5,500 years ago, the villages of Mesopotamia were fast growing into busy towns. Trade was very important, and with that, it became necessary to keep an accurate record of how many sheep and how much beer and grain was passing in and out of the stores. So I want this goat, I don't want all these sheep, please keep this one. Oh.
In a time before writing, the Mesopotamians came up with the idea of using different shaped tokens to represent different animals. So in theory, if I want to buy, say, 5 goats and 4 sheep, all I have to do is drop the right number of shaped tokens into a clay envelope called a bula as the animals walk past me. I then have a permanent record of how many animals I bought.
I've lost my goats.
Well, that's the theory anyway.
Well, the system works. I've got my 5 goats and my 4 sheep. But as you can see, it's pretty difficult to count sheep and count tokens at the same time. So to make it simpler, some bright spot came up with the idea of just pressing the token onto the outside of the clay and making a shape. Pretty soon, drawings of the tokens were being used instead of the tokens themselves, so there was no need for a bulla to keep them in. Flat clay tablets were much easier to work with and fitted neatly into the writer's palm. A tool called a stylus, made out of bone or wood, was used to mark the soft clay. Remind you of anything? Now, you could draw a picture of a token, but it was much easier just to make a mark. A Mesopotamian stylus left very neat little wedge-shaped marks. The first written words were fashioned from these distinctive wedges, a style known as cuneiform. Cuneiform was the main script of the ancient Near East and lasted for nearly 3,000 years. When they excavated the ancient city of Ebla, they found 17,000 of these clay tablets. You can still see the marks left by the shelves that they rested on in the royal library. When cities fell in battle, the victors torched the buildings. But that very act of destruction ensured the preservation of the tablets as they were fired and baked hard by the flames. Only a few highly trained scribes learned the art of cuneiform. The vast majority of the population, right up to kings, was illiterate. This private letter begins, "Say to the Lord, my king." So we know he couldn't read it for himself, which meant the scribes could wield enormous power. I wonder if they ever pulled the wool over anyone's eyes.
Once they had writing, the Mesopotamians weren't about to stop at just keeping records of sheep and goats. Before long, they were producing the world's first novels, although those books were written on clay. One of the greatest stories of all time is the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh. This is the tale of a legendary king of Sumer who sets out to discover the secret of immortality. Along the way, he defeats a demon, he sees a friend die, and he learns important lessons about mortal life.
Doesn't the flood get into Gilgamesh?
Yes, it's the last bit of the story, because when he crosses the water of death, the boatman tells Gilgamesh about his own adventures and how the flood came and destroyed the world and an ark was built, rather like in the book of Genesis.
So are they the same story?
They are, in the sense that the story in the Bible must derive from a Middle Eastern narrative which has long been in circulation.
Right. But generally what we read in Gilgamesh tells us quite a lot about Mesopotamia, does it? I mean, it's not meant to be history, but...
No, it's literature, it's myth and literature on a high level. But it also tells us a lot about the world in which Gilgamesh lived, I mean, because he was a historical character, and the kind of impression you get of the bustling city of Uruk, which was a huge city, trade, contact, wars, all the sort of things that are incidental to the narrative are in fact a rather faithful picture of what life must have been like at that time.
In his quest for immortality, Gilgamesh travels to the island of Dilmun, the modern state of Bahrain in the Arabian Gulf. Here he dives to the bottom of the sea, searching for the plant of everlasting life.
Now, in fact, the very first line of the story, and some say its true title, is "He who saw the deep." And incredibly, that is the first ever recorded dive in history. Now, to get there, Gilgamesh ties a heavy stone to his feet to drag him into the ocean. And that gives us a clue as to what men were really diving for here back in Mesopotamian times. Because tying weights to their feet to get to the bottom of the sea is exactly what pearl divers do.
Pearls have been harvested here for some 5,000 years, and Bahrain once supplied 80% of the world demand. But after the Japanese came up with the idea of cultivating pearls back in the 1920s, the bottom fell out of the natural pearl market. Since ancient times, Bahrainian pearls were prized for their beauty. That's thought to be partly due to the unusual nature of the waters around the island. Beneath the seabed lie natural freshwater springs. Fresh water percolating up through the oyster beds creates a unique marine environment, which is said to improve the luster of the pearls.
Pearls were used to make jewellery. They were known as fish eyes, And the Mesopotamians were willing to travel hundreds of miles across open sea to get here and trade for them. So let's see if I can find one. Look, there is a pearl. A totally natural pearl. Wow. Now the same fresh water that nourishes these oysters made Dilmun an essential port of call on a much greater journey. And the evidence for that lies back on shore. Look, there it is.
For thousands of years, sailors stopped over on the island of Dilmun to stock up on water and supplies. And they left behind proof that the Mesopotamian world stretched far beyond the Euphrates and the Tigris.
Bahrain is one of the world's largest burial grounds. It's estimated that there's 100,000 graves here. And lying together within these burial mounds, archaeologists have found artifacts from Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley. Evidence that maritime trading networks linked the Mesopotamians with other civilizations as far away as the Indian subcontinent. And clues as to how they might have travelled that far come from another passage in the remarkable epic of Gilgamesh. Because as Gilgamesh rows his boat across the waters of death on his way here to Dilmun, he manages to break his oars. His solution is to take off his companion's shirt and hold it up to the wind, the first ever mention of a sail.
The invention of the sail allowed the Mesopotamians to develop a vast trading empire up and down the Tigris and Euphrates and out into the Arabian Gulf. Bulk transport of things like stone, timber and metals was really possible only by water. They didn't have a lot of timber in those days, so they couldn't have made boats like this. They probably made them out of reeds covered with bitumen, which would keep them watertight and also keep out little aquatic monsters that would otherwise eat their way in. The rigging is very simple, just simple square sail. And it's virtually impossible to sail into the wind or close hauled. So they would have had to use oars or paddles to get upwind or against the current. But the open sail must have dramatically improved their times when they were going with the wind in the right direction. Being able to trade with their neighbours was vital to Mesopotamian societies. But all too often, what started out as peaceful commerce ended up in outright war. When the magnificent Sumerian city of was excavated in the 1920s, archaeologists found the earliest evidence of organised warfare. One artefact, the Standard of shows uniformed soldiers carrying regulation weapons from 4,500 years ago. Some were fanatically loyal to their king. In the royal tombs lay the bodies of soldiers and attendants. Next to each, a small cup of poison. They had committed suicide just to accompany their ruler into the afterlife. Conflict raged between city-states throughout Mesopotamian history. The mightiest of all the military powers were the Assyrians. They ruled the greatest empire of the time, which stretched from Egypt in the west to the borders of Iran in the east. Left, right, left, halt! Now, Marty is a typical Assyrian foot soldier, and I, of course, am the king. Now, tell us about your weapons.
Right, well, let me give you this first.
Too heavy for you, is it?
Yeah, this this is the primary weapon of the Assyrian army.
Right.
This, if I can fish it out,
hang on to it, okay,
is a bow.
Yeah, I can see
650 metres.
650 metres?
That's what they say.
That's a long way. But anyway, Marty, you're no bum, you couldn't hit the castle. Right.
That tower over there.
Well, the castle over there.
Come on.
You hit the tower. Right, so there's your bow and arrow.
So there's my bow and arrow.
Right.
So you'd soften up the troops with that first.
You fire that first?
A few of those first.
What about your spear here?
Now this thing, I can just pick it up. This came in 1000 BC.
Right.
And this would have been used to fend off the enemy from a bit of a distance, you know, keep them
away from out of sword length.
So that they can't get you, but you can get them.
Yeah, that's a pretty nasty weapon, isn't it? The Assyrian army was fantastically well equipped and well organised. In fact, there was no better army until the Romans came along 1,000 years later. They were really good at logistics, at getting all the men, all the weapons and all the food ready for them. And because they were surrounded by rivers, they needed one special secret piece of equipment. Marty, you'll enjoy this. Have a look at this. Now this, nobody knows about this. Just look. Oh, I think that's for the foot soldier.
I'd rather not, to be honest.
Really? I know what, we should test it on location.
Good idea.
Yes, to Hermione with love.
Mesopotamia did, after all, mean the land between two rivers. So an army had to be able to cross water if it was going to be any use at all. Every soldier had an inflatable goat skin as part of his kit. Now, in theory, this provided enough buoyancy to keep him and all his kit afloat. It's time to test it out. It takes quite a lot of puff to blow this up. It's pretty disgusting. Oh! That's quite good, actually.
The Assyrian army was rarely defeated by rivers. The infantry could blow up the skins as they paddled across. Horses were guided by swimmers, and heavier items such as chariots or siege engines were broken down and ferried across in skin boats.
It's quite hard to manoeuvre. I think it's deflating. Oh, I've made it. And the goat skin hasn't done too badly. It's still partially inflated. But I can certainly see why Adam and Marty didn't want to try it out. Crossing rivers was one thing. Overcoming the enormous fortifications that the Mesopotamians started building around their cities around 3000 BC was altogether another challenge. My entire army would have to negotiate this complex tripartite gate. Imagine all the men being channeled through this narrow area, while at the mercy of the defenders on top, before getting anywhere near the city. You know what would be a lot easier is if I could just bash my way through those mud brick walls.
The Mesopotamians had the technology to bring those walls tumbling down. The Akkadian king Sargon the Great conquered city after city with battering rams well before 2000 BC. Later, the Assyrians came up with prefabricated siege engines equipped with metal-tipped rams. These magnificent wheeled towers could be quickly assembled on campaign and trundled up to the defenders' walls. The great thing about this wonderful ram on the front is that it's adjustable up and down. It's not really a battering ram so much as a prizing ram. With luck, we can prize off those mud bricks layer by layer and just work our way into the castle. We're through the outer defences. Now, the gates of the castle. In 701 BC, the Assyrian king Sennacherib attacked the walled city of Lachish in Judea. At the forefront of the attack were his mighty siege engines, packed full of archers. The defenders of Lachish threw down blazing torches, but Sennacherib's men doused the flames with long-handled ladles of water. Marty, is this your cunning plan?
Get on with it, Adam.
OK. Seems to have sorted it right. On to the gates.
Adam, they've got spears.
Oh! Wow, God, that was close, wasn't it?
No serious damage.
Now, we're almost at the gates. The weakest point of any city wall was the gate. Once through, Lachish was at Sennacherib's mercy. He was so proud of his victory that he had the story of his bloody campaign carved on the walls of his palace at Nineveh. In the words of Lord Byron in his poem The Destruction of Sennacherib, the Assyrian came down like a wolf on the fold. OK, stop. We're right in the middle of the courtyard. This is an absolutely fabulous vehicle for attacking castles because it's great defensive stuff. It can take fire, it can take spears, it can take rocks, everything. But if you're out in the open battlefield, you really need something a bit quicker. I've sent Hermione off to go and try and reconstruct one of the most fearsome weapons that the Mesopotamians had. Right, chaps, through the back of the castle. We can go anywhere with this thing.
Aleppo in northern Syria claims to be the world's oldest inhabited city. People have lived here continuously for 8,000 years. It's had its fair share of strife. I've come here to try to recreate one of the earliest fighting machines, a Sumerian War Chariot.
I'm basing the design for our reconstruction on the magnificent four-wheeled chariots shown on the standard of Ur. Also discovered in the royal tombs at Ur were the remains of the distinctive solid wheels which bore the chariot into battle.
These were basically mobile missile carriers, packed full with weapons and riding on 4 solid wheels. Is this my carpenter's? Okay, shukran.
Yes.
Hi, good afternoon. I was wondering whether we could talk about the possibility of building a chariot. Shall we go in? Thank you. This is the chariot. This is a picture of the chariot that I want to get built. And this bit should all be made of wood. And these wheels look like that. They're solid wheels, no spokes. They're made of 3 parts, the special Mesopotamian wheels. Now, what I've got here is a model of a toy chariot that was found in a 5,000-year-old tomb. So it's just a model, but it gives you an idea of what the chariot should look like.
Yes.
So, do you think you can build one?
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
Okay, shukran. Thank you.
While the carpenters get started on the chariot, I'm off in search of everything else I need. Luckily, the Aleppo souk is full of traditional shops and craftsmen.
Through here? Okay, what I'm looking for is some spears. Like long, tall, sharp, like a javelin. Do you have any of them? Yeah? Oh yeah, these are great. This is just what I need. Perfect.
One of the most vital parts of the Sumerian chariot was the rein ring. With it, the driver was able to control the donkeys that pulled the heavy vehicle along.
Great, thank you very much.
The chariot wouldn't have been possible without what may be the greatest invention of all time, the wheel. Now, I thought you could just take a big log of wood, cut a slice out of it like that, and then stick an axle in the middle and you've got a wheel. But the trouble is, it doesn't work. For one thing, it splits. Just look, there are splits developing all round this wheel. It's absolutely hopeless. So they couldn't do that. Marty, what did they do?
Well, what they came up with is this. This is what's called a tripartite wheel. You pitch it up like that. Tripartite's got 3 bits to it. One there, one plank there, a plank in the middle, and a plank there.
Why couldn't they just take one big plank?
Ah, well, you see, the thing is, the size of your plank is dependent on the size of your trees.
Yes.
Because obviously the biggest plank you can have is
the same diameter as the tree.
Biggest tree. And they didn't have very big trees.
Ah,
so
that would slow them up. I do.
So they made this out of the biggest trees they could get, the biggest planks they could make, and they, put several of them together.
Now, wouldn't it be easier just to put one plank there and then one in the middle and one your side?
Well, that's what they started doing, but then they developed this because it's stronger and it's got fewer joins at the edges.
Ah, because if you had 3 planks, you'd have 1, 2, 4.
You've got 4 joins.
And now we've only got 2.
Yeah.
But what keeps them sort of in line?
Well, in here we've got a bunch of pegs.
Right. Let's have a look.
There you go. So here we go. There's a bunch of little pegs here which meet up with holes in here, and that obviously stops the planks from sort of shifting out of alignment. And then just with some lashing, some string here and here, that holds it all together.
Yeah. That's quite cunning, isn't it? And what about the chunk in the middle?
Well, this would have been an actual bit of a log cut through with a hole drilled in it,
right,
and then sank into the middle. Obviously, it's not a very big log,
right,
and then the axle goes through
The axle just goes through there.
Exactly.
And this turns on the axle.
Yeah,
right?
and then because it's so wide, it doesn't wobble around so much.
Ah, because if it was thin, it would wobble that way.
Exactly.
That's great. That's really quite simple, isn't it? Anyway, let's see how Hermione is getting on with her chariot.
Got you the rein ring. It's finished. fantastic. Hey, مرحبا.
مرحبا. أهلا
It's
وسهلا.
brilliant. God, it's amazing.
كويس كويس.
Wow. God, you feel quite high up here, actually. Quite high. Now all we have to do is take it for a proper test drive. Our chariot has a 2-mule power engine. We know the Sumerians would have used 4 highly trained donkeys, capable of pulling their chariots at up to 20 miles an hour. There's a good solid wooden framework. Now, unlike the modern car, the leatherwork is on the outside. It was put on when it was wet, and as it dried, it pulled the whole bodywork of the chariot together, giving it added strength. We've got some built-in road rage protection here. More rawhide on the outside of the wheel. And with these bindings, that's holding together the 3 solid bits of wood that make up the tripartite wheels. They were basically mobile missile launchers packed with weapons. One man drove while another hurled javelins. It's thought an expert javelin thrower could launch up to 30 javelins a minute. If necessary, he could jump off the back with an axe for a bit of hand-to-hand combat. If they'd never seen one before, chariots like these would have been terrifying to the enemy. But what they didn't know was all they had to do was jump out the way, because they were useless at turning corners. Why was that?
Turning a vehicle like Humana's Cimmerian Chariot was incredibly difficult. For one thing, it had a very high centre of gravity, so if you started to turn, it was liable to tip over. For another thing, these huge wooden wheels were on a fixed axle. Remember, it had 4 wheels, 2 axles, and the axles were fixed, so they couldn't turn, so they were being dragged sideways. And that meant that not only was the chariot likely to break up, but so were the wheels, because they're made in 3 parts, and they can't take sideways forces, which meant you could charge into battle, but it was a sort of kamikaze mission, because you couldn't turn around and come back again. All that changed with the Assyrians, who invented to start with the spoked wheel, much, much more efficient. For one thing, there are all these air spaces, so it's much, much lighter. And for another thing, it's strong in all directions, and you can turn this easily. And of course, you can turn it much more easily if you've only got 2 wheels. Okay, let's go. Humana's Sumerian chariot handles like a truck, but this is a sports car. Chariot design gradually evolved. They were improved by the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans, and surprisingly by the Britons. But it was the Mesopotamians who got the whole thing rolling in the first place. In ancient Mesopotamia, civilization flourished 5,500 years ago. The invention of writing gave human beings history, which meant that the people who came afterwards knew about the thoughts and the deeds of their ancestors for the first time. The Mesopotamians gave us the wheel, farming, cities, bureaucracy, astrology, bread, beer, the list goes on and on. But a whole lot of their inventions were forgotten and had to be reinvented hundreds, even thousands of years later. Babylon was conquered by the Persians in 539 BC, and after the Persians came the Greeks and the Romans and loads of other people, but actually it was those ancient Mesopotamians who more than anyone else shaped the world that we live in today.